Okay. So welcome everyone to the Buddhist Path of Awakening as we work our way through Volume 1 of the Profound Treasury of the Ocean of Dharma by Chogyam Trungpa. I've said it before and I'll say it again. The name of the book is kind of almost a joke. You see, it's the Profound Treasury of the Ocean of Dharma. Well, the Ocean of Dharma was Chogyam Trungpa's name. That's what Chogyam means in Tibetan. It means Ocean of Dharma. So this is the Profound Treasury of the Ocean of Dharma. I guess somebody was having fun. So tonight we got chapter 52, and I think John Tyler is leading off. Right, John?
Yes. So we're entering section 4, the Four Noble Truths, and chapter 52 is entitled "Dissecting the Experience of Suffering." Oops, hold on one second. There we go. And just as a little introduction, the Four Noble Truths were introduced by the Buddha as his first teaching. He introduced him to his students at Deer Park near Varanasi in India. He presented both the Four Noble Truths and, as I understand it, the Noble Eightfold Path as well. The Four Noble Truths are organized into two groups. The first two, the truth of suffering and the truth of the nature of suffering, are about the samsaric versions of ourselves. And the second two, the truth of the cessation of suffering and the truth of the path, are about how we go beyond or overcome samsara. That is the journey in nirvana, freedom, and emancipation. We always work with what is here, with our own experience. We find that our basic existence is fundamentally awake. However, at the same time, there are obstacles along our path, and the obstacles are typically the ego, the I and other, our habitual patterns, which manifest themselves in many different ways. And the first noble truth, the truth of suffering, addresses this. In Sanskrit, the word for suffering is dukkha, which translates as misery or restlessness or uneasiness. And in Tibetan, the suffering is known as dugnal. Dug meaning reduced to a lower level or wretchedness, and nagal meaning perpetuating. So together they translate as perpetuating wretchedness. In the truth of suffering, we need to embrace this truth if we are to understand who we are and what we are doing with ourselves. It is absolutely necessary for us to realize how we torture ourselves with our addiction to our habitual patterns. These are seen as our striving to achieve constant entertainment. Trungpa uses the perpetual need to travel in this chapter as an analogy to illustrate how our habitual patterns drive our behavior. He talks about an imaginary person purchasing many travel tickets, and even while on the airplane realizing that they might not have ongoing travel planned, and calling the travel agent and ordering another ticket to keep going. And I think this is an apt analogy for what we find out when we start to realize, when we start to become aware of how ingrained our habitual patterns are. We realize that we constantly are looking for these areas of entertainment to keep ourselves feeling comfortable and normal. So there are 8 types of suffering. They're broken down into 2 groups. The first group is inherited suffering. That's the group I'll be talking about. And the second group is suffering between birth and death. The area of inherited suffering includes some familiar areas: birth, old age, sickness, and death. And starting with birth, birth is the hassle involved with being alive in the most general sense. At birth, we move from a very warm, comfortable place into a situation where we experience our first exposure to the world, which consists of many inconveniences, such as hot and cold, trying to make our needs understood when we don't have the benefit of language, and more generally, the pain of birth can be seen as our resistance to relating with the new demands that are being made on us by the world. In other words, we like to be where we are. We do not favor for the most part, we do not favor change. And this idea of the experience of birth plays into this, over the longer haul, plays into this idea of wanting to maintain a constant, knowable reality. We are, I think, always trying to settle down in a situation where you think that at last you've got it made. This is it. This is the way it's going to be for the duration. And we're constantly disappointed by the fact that in reality, that is not the case. You really don't want to exit this warm, comfortable space. And that reading this chapter has made me think about that idea of floating around in amniotic fluid before you're born. That beautiful stasis of comfort. And as human beings, and being habitually addicted to entertainment, we really don't, we want to remain in that warm, comfortable space. We don't want to be born. We want things to stay the same the way they are. The next category is old age, which a few of us are starting to realize the joys of. Old age does not purely refer to being old. It refers to aging, or a progression from birth to old age. Old age is a process of loss of entertainment. Things don't last. The things that in your life you begin to realize are slowly changing. You can't see as well, you lose your hearing, you realize it's much harder to physically to do things that in your youth you took for granted. These things begin to weigh on you. There's a general experience of decay. You feel you no longer have time. You no longer look forward to future situations. And that's something that's real. That I've experienced that. It's an amazing experience, really. As we get older, we aren't getting the entertainment we used to get out of things. The suffering of aging can apply both to your psychological as well as your physical experiences. This is I think aging, the idea of aging is another way of having a lot of thoughts generated, probably more so than in your youth, when you felt that you would be living perpetually. The next area is sickness. And sickness is common to both old and young. Sickness is based on a panic, that the feeling that arises when you're sick is based on a panic that something might be terribly wrong with you and that you might die. It's also a major inconvenience. the lack of knowing what the outcome will be is dramatic. When the sickness is serious, you may have to check into a hospital, and this experience is not an experience of comfort and lightness. It's an experience of helplessness and not being able to control your situation. So there's a background of discomfort and lack of control, and the experience itself generates resentment toward the condition of helplessness. The suffering of sickness includes all kinds of expectations that are no longer being met. You resent, and finally, you resent that your entertainment has been interrupted. You are totally focused on the condition you find yourself in and trying to understand it and trying to navigate it. Also, in conclusion, the first signs of death tend to occur when you are seriously ill. So you have to confront that idea of impermanence as well in the condition of sickness. Finally, the area of suffering of death, the last of the forms of inherited suffering. Death is the sense that you have no opportunity to continue further in your life and its endeavors. Complaining doesn't work, as there's no one to complain to. Death requires you to completely leave everything that you love and are familiar with, even your habitual patterns, even those things that you've used to help you navigate your life. A further pain associated with death is that you have so completely identified yourself with your body that it is hard to imagine that in death you'll be losing your body. Saying goodbye to your own body is very difficult. Yes, very difficult. And death is also a matter of leaving everything you want, everything you've possessed and hung on to, including the possibility of Dharma. We all think we can fight against death. We all hold out the thought of everlasting life. That is a very key statement, I think. It's surprising how we speak of impermanence over and over and over again, and yet I wonder how often each of us really believes that that's going to be in fact the case. Finally, in conclusion, in our ordinary everyday life, you experience situations similar to death all the time. Death is an exaggeration of the previous three types of suffering, that is birth, old age, and sickness. You start with birth, you begin to settle in, you tend to put up with old age as an understandable ongoing process. You can relate to sickness as a natural situation, but finally you find the whole scheme is going to end. Nothing lasts long, and this is, as Trungpa says, this is very shocking to all of us. With that, I'll turn it over to Philip.
Thank you, John. Welcome, everyone. Cheer up. So we continue with chapter 52, dissecting the experience of suffering. So I remember the first time I read this chapter and the first time I saw this title. And I want to say up front that you will all do better here to take the long view. With all due respect to the editor, Judy Leaf, and I respect her immensely. She was my preceptor when I took my Bodhisattva vows. I think a more accurate title for this chapter would be Liberation is Certain. Liberation is Certain. And that's the title I want you to keep in mind as we move forward tonight. So at this point, you may well be asking, why all this analysis about suffering? So there's a good reason why Buddhists seem obsessed with suffering. Suffering is the central problem that Buddhism addresses, and recognizing our suffering is the first step to its solution. Suffering is one of the universal truths, along with impermanence and non-self, egolessness. It's one of the three basic qualities, one of the three basic marks of existence. And suffering comes in many forms. To help us recognize our suffering and so begin to seek its cause and cessation, Buddhists have broken it down into these different categories. So two basic frameworks of suffering are presented in this chapter. There's an 8-part framework and a 3-pattern framework. And I'll toggle back and forth between the two so you can keep them lined up. Chogyam Trungpa began this chapter with the 8-part framework, which is divided into 3 subdivisions. John just finished the first subdivision, inherited suffering, which covers birth, old age, sickness, and death, the suffering that comes with the territory of simply being alive. We acknowledge this every time we chant the dedication of merit, from the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may I free all beings. In the simpler 3-pattern framework that we'll consider later in this chapter, this first subdivision, inherited suffering, the one John just covered, is called the suffering of suffering. Because life is suffering, right? So the first suffering you get is the suffering of suffering. This will all get simpler as we move through it. So I'll pick up here with a second subdivision of the 8-part framework, what Chogyam Trungpa calls the suffering of the period between birth and death. And this has to do basically with not getting what you want and instead getting what you don't want. And it also includes getting what you want, but then losing it. This type of suffering is psychological, rooted in the fact that we are never satisfied. As the saying goes, more is never enough, a motto of an addict. That's how we move through our life. In the simpler 3-pattern framework, this subdivision is called the suffering of change. And this is a good way to think of this kind of suffering. If Buddhism teaches us anything, it teaches us about impermanence. Everything comes down to change. So the second subdivision of the 8-part framework, suffering of the period between birth and death, comprises the next 3 parts. So we're on the bottom of page 390 here in the text. Part 5, coming across what's not desirable, getting what you don't want. Generally, we have 2 reactions to this. 1, blaming someone else, and or 2, freaking out. Part 6, not being able to hold on to what is desirable. Generally, 2 reactions are possible here as well. 1 is resentfulness, and 2 is trying to see it as somebody else's problem. Part 7, not getting what you want. There's always a new problem just over the horizon. Nothing will satisfy us. Things don't ever quite work out. So those 3 parts make up the second subdivision of the 8-part framework. The third subdivision is what Chogyam Trungpa calls general misery, or all-pervasive suffering. In the simpler 3-pattern framework, this subdivision is also called all-pervasive suffering. This subdivision has just 1 part. That's enough. And that's part 8, general misery. This is quite a different form of suffering altogether. This is more subtle. It is the general misery and dysfunction that goes on all the time, whether we recognize it or not. It is essential human discontent. It is based on the inheritance of neurosis. We cannot experience just one thing without having some contrast to it. Chogyam Trungpa says, general misery is connected with constant movement, flickering thoughts, latching onto one situation after another, or constantly changing subjects. Your satisfaction is largely based on no longer feeling the pain that you experienced the moment before. Right? That's as good as it gets. He says this last form of suffering is supposedly so subtle that it can only be perceived by realized ones. He says, ordinarily you're immune to your own suffering. You've learned to live with it. You are immune to the disaster of the kleshas that make you stupid and keep you wandering around. All right, this completes the 8-part framework. Now we move on to the simpler framework of suffering, one more commonly used in Buddhism, namely the 3 patterns. They are the suffering of change, and all-pervasive suffering. This is the framework you'll most likely encounter in the future as you move forward with your Buddhist studies. The 3 patterns, the suffering of change, and all-pervasive suffering. So, 1, the suffering of suffering, generally considered birth, old age, sickness, and death. Chogyam Trungpa also includes coming across what is not desirable, i.e. getting what you don't want. But most other teachers would include that in the 2nd pattern, which is the suffering of change, number 2. Not getting what you want and getting what you don't want. Most teachers would also include here getting what you want, then losing it, since the nature of everything is impermanence. All the things that bring you joy in the beginning ultimately decay in the end. Chogyam Trungpa identifies 2 categories here, trying to hold on to what is desirable and not getting or not even knowing what you want. And number 3, all-pervasive suffering, essential human discontent. This is the type of suffering we are most likely not to recognize, yet the most instructive when we do. It's the general background of anxiety and insecurity that colors even our happiest moments. Deep down, we fear that life doesn't offer us solid ground and that our very existence is questionable. From a Buddhist point of view, these doubts are well-founded, and exploring them offers glimpses of wisdom. All right, this completes the 3-level framework. It's 8 o'clock at night here in New England. You guys must be tired, so let me simplify this for you and summarize. We experience 3 levels of suffering. 1, the suffering of suffering, birth, old age, sickness, and death. These are physical sufferings. 2, the suffering of change, not getting what you want and getting what you don't want. Even if you do get what you want, you can't hold on to it. These are psychological sufferings. 3, all-pervasive suffering, essential human discontent. These are existential sufferings. And that's it in a nutshell. But we're not quite done yet. This chapter goes on a bit more. It gets more profound, and also somehow at the end, it even becomes delightful. You'll see. Chogyam Trungpa says that there's no such thing as real human happiness. We're on page 394 here. He says it's a myth. He says we started at the wrong end of the stick from the very beginning. Something went wrong as we began ourselves. We are trying to entertain ourselves in the wrong way by having an ego, by having fixation. But we cannot get any pleasure out of fixation. And after that, the whole thing goes down the drain. However, if we start without fixation, without clinging, without grasping or craving, then a different result is possible. So in this paragraph, Chogyam Trungpa touches on all 4 of the 4 Noble Truths. You can think of the 4 Noble Truths simply as 1, the problem, 2, the mechanism of the problem, 3, the solution, 4, the mechanism of the solution. Chogyam Trungpa is pointing out here, the problem is suffering. Its mechanism is ego, fixation, clinging, grasping, craving. The solution is the elimination of ego. Its mechanism is the path. from taming the mind all the way through to realizing reality. It's like a doctor diagnosing and treating an illness. We begin by defining the problem. The problem here is suffering. Then the question becomes, what can we do about it? That's what the following chapters are all about. That's what Buddhism is all about. Chogyam Trungpa finishes this chapter with an important paradigm shift. In the last section, Overcoming Neurotic Pain, he summarizes just how awful everything really is. But then he talks about sanity and clarity, and he quotes Jamgon Kongtrul saying, "The ultimate understanding of pain is that you cannot get rid of your pain, but you can have a higher understanding of pain." So once more, the ultimate understanding of pain is that you cannot get rid of your pain, but you can have a higher understanding of pain. So what does this really mean? Chogyam Trungpa makes a critical distinction here between pain and suffering. They are two separate things, two different things. And this is the key to understanding how this all works. Pain comes with the territory, birth, old age, sickness, and death, what John was talking about. But suffering is a choice we make. The basic takeaway is this: we can save ourselves from suffering and misery if we practice the teachings. It's not psychology or philosophy. It's simply crude, primitive Hinayana truth. Sit and practice. Then you will be out of your misery. It's not a fairy tale. We can learn to choose more wisely. That's what the path is all about. Suffering comes from ego and grasping. We can learn to sit and practice. We can discover liberation. It's not just talk. It's not even complicated. It's right here in front of us. Just sit. Cheer up. Liberation is certain. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, John and Philip. So we can have a discussion. What does it say? Pain is mandatory, suffering is optional. That's the slogan. Does that fit, Philip?
Yes, Dan says that all the time. You say that all the time. Vicky, you have a question.
Yes. The last thing you said, I'm still rolling it around. Liberation is certain. I guess I'm not, I get my head around. Can you elaborate?
Yes, that's what the Four Noble Truths are about. So you start with sort of like this kick in the teeth and facing reality, that life is suffering. And from there, you begin to understand that the root cause of suffering is our own ego, our grasping and our craving, this constant more is never enough, this constant me, 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 me. Number three is there's a way out, namely getting rid of that ego, that essential, profound misapprehension of everything. And then four is the way to do that. That's what the path is all about. 1, 2, 3, 4. You can be free of this.
So I'm not sure we can ever really get rid of ego, but by having compassion for all other sentient beings, that's a doorway that's always available.
So as long as we're here on this planet, and as long as we have time to chip away at this mountain of ego, we can do that. We can make it smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller every day. And each day our vision will become broader. Each day our compassion will become greater. Each day our clinging and grasping will become less. Each day our happiness will become greater. The pain won't go away, but it won't bother us so much. It won't be my pain so much. It won't be Philip Russell's pain is the worst pain anybody had ever experienced so much.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
And practice. Practice is a way of getting, you might say, getting away from pain. In other words, the pain lies in ego's thoughts about I and other. And when we practice and we come present, we give up those thoughts and we give up the pain momentarily for longer or shorter periods of time as you come more or less present, more or less awake, rather than lost in thought. Pain lives in thought. Would you say, Philip? You agree?
Yes, but I was thinking that I was misleading you a little bit, Vicky, because it's not just a gradual path. At some point, there is a shift, and you suddenly understand that you are not separate from the rest of the universe, that you are part of the rest of the universe, that your pain isn't your pain. There is pain in the universe that everyone has. You do, Vicky does, Henry does, Tanya does, everyone does.
Yeah.
So it is gradual until there's a sudden shift, and then there is that sudden shift, that sudden realization that everything you had understood up to this point was totally wrong.
In my own limited experience, as I've worked on this the last 4 years with, well, 3 or 4 years with this group, and I live with chronic pain and chronic fatigue. When it's working, what you're talking about, and it does, the pain is less than, my pain is less important. It's not this, I mean, I'm just so aware of pain around me, pain going on in other places, that in its own way is so much worse than mine. You know, we get into this comparison game, but that's how I feel it's working. So I think your presentation and John Tyler's presentation is just beautiful. Thank you.
Thanks. I think you're absolutely right. So a couple of things come to mind. So you could say Buddhism is nothing if not changing your point of view. Or you could say everything in Buddhism comes down to this question, compared to what? But what I really want to say to you is that with the understanding that this pain that is part of the universal experience, and which is often greater than your own individual Vicky's pain, is just a part of the universal experience. You also begin to experience the rest of it. And there's this enormous beauty that is part of the universal experience. It's all mashed together.
I do think that slogan that, pain is, I don't know what the term is, unavoidable. Suffering is optional.
Inevitable.
Really says a lot, because we have pain. You're going to get sick. You'll have pain in your body and the loss of things, that are important or whatever it may be. But the suffering comes from thinking about and holding on to and complaining and feeling less than. And that's what we give up in meditation. We give up those mental activities and simply see it. So suffering is optional. And I think that's really the path to the third noble truth.
I think you can't stress the importance of that too much either. uh, the practice, while you you always feel as though, or at least I do, I'm not there yet. Uh, it has offered benefits far beyond anything I could have ever imagined. Um, just that, I don't know if you call it the discipline of the practice, but you change your way of seeing things. It changes you. And in that sense, I think it makes it easier to avoid or minimize the suffering. I'm not sure you can get rid of it, but I think you can minimize it.
Yeah, and
Change.
I think we're talking about the Hinayana stage of the path a lot here, of the idea of eliminating suffering by changing your mind, by coming present, by giving up the wish that things were different, which is suffering. The Mahayana stage of the path goes even further, and it says that there is a profound realization, a wake up, that what you thought was I was a myth, a mistake, an error, that I doesn't actually exist. It's a fiction, and a pernicious one. I and other. And so one awakens to emptiness, to shunyata, empty of I and other, empty of that mistake. And that's an even more profound version of giving up suffering. The pain will still be there. You're a human being. You know, you're going to stub your toe and have pain. The question is, how do we regard it? And that's what Buddhism is all about. Getting on a stage, you just come present. Give up the thoughts about it. The Mahayana stage, you've actually realized that those thoughts were wrong, that I and other don't exist, that they're fictions.
And Fred, if you let me jump ahead, compassion is all wrapped up in that too. Because as you give up your own ego-centeredness and begin to realize that John's pain, I begin to realize John's pain is no different than my pain. My pain is no different than John's pain. From there to compassion is not a step at all. There, it's just compassion is automatically there. Fred, you have your hand up.
You just said something, John, about the I being a myth, and I've said this before, that I think some confusion in the West that we have is the idea of God, right? And I've been kind of saying that that's an estimate. It's an estimate of the absolute creative force or something. It's something ineffable, where it points towards absolute bodhicitta, or the absolute truth. Is that also part of the Mahayana path?
The belief in God is a belief in that something other than one has true existence, and that's utterly denied in the Mahayana path. It's regarded as just a fiction, a figment of your imagination. And in fact, nothing has true existence. Everything is a constant presentation. Right now, with this gesture moving across the screen, the pixels changing, the sound of these words coming out and disappearing. Everything is a constant arising and passing away in the instant, in which nothing inheres. So the idea of I and other, of God is sort of the ultimate other. Neither one of them, they're just concepts from a Buddhist perspective.
So that might be like the other half of it, the ego of Dharma, right? The ego of self and then the ego of Dharma. I think God falls into that.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
A metaphor that's helped me a lot is to think of everything as an unbounded ocean, an ocean without limits. And we, each of us, as we think of ourselves as individual selves, we're a wave on that ocean, a temporary appearance. We're not disconnected from the ocean at all. We're not different from the ocean at all. No wave is different than any other wave, except for the moment that it seems to be there and it looks different. But essentially, it's all the same. The tragedy is that usually we can't see anything except that little bit of a wave tip, and we think that's who we are. We think that's all that we are. And that's profoundly wrong. That's totally in error. So the word God, I have no idea what that means. But, you could, it's just a label. Buddhists use labels as one of the mechanisms to understand emptiness, right? Doesn't mean anything, it's just a label. But you could label the ocean God if you want. Or you could label the ocean the universe, or you could label the ocean mind. So Buddhists are fond of saying it's beyond words and concepts. And I agree 100%. It's totally beyond words and concepts, but that's all we've got to work with, are words and concepts. The words I use for it now are infinite potential. If someone were to ask me, Philip, what is it all about? What is the universe all about in 2 words? What is reality all about? What is mind all about? I would choose these 2 right now. Infinite potential. It's what John has said for years. Things seem to arise, they seem to exist, and they seem to subside. And the question becomes, where do they come from? Where do they go to? Well, you could call it ground, or you could call it groundlessness. It's the same thing.
Well, what they actually say is that nothing arises, nothing endures, and nothing passes away. It's just nothing there. It's just a seeming, like a TV show.
Yeah, we get causes and condition. And then with that, it's what came first, the chicken or the egg, right?
It's an arbitrary construct, causes and conditions. It's a conceptual overlay that's being laid on to this really indefinable melange of experience, this constant, vivid arising and passing, and we put these concepts on it. Really, in the tantras, they go beyond the idea of existence and non-existence, which is very Mahayana. That's shunyata, emptiness, voidness, and all they talk about there basically is luminosity. That all of this, which doesn't have any true existence, nevertheless arises and passes away, seems to, luminously, a constant luminous presentation. They say that emptiness, shunyata, and luminosity, prabhasvara in Sanskrit, are in union. Because things don't exist, everything is luminous, a constant, vivid beauty, presentation. The 6 knowables. And so Tantra is all about this huge celebration, about the beauty of the phenomenal world as it arises and passes away with no substance, no real existence, and yet this display. And it's this huge celebration of it. And eventually, at the end of the path, beyond that, they even get beyond that, the celebration. Trungpa Rinpoche said the very, very last stage, beyond Dzogchen, beyond Ati, is what it's not even in the teachings really. he said it was what his teacher told him. It's called old dog. And he said at that stage, you're like an old dog that's lying in the dirt and swiping the flies away from its nose with its tail, half, half asleep. Funny path we're on.
So what the old dog is doing is appreciating the brilliance of the universe. It is this brilliant display. So we're limited by our senses. A bat or an old dog would have a very different experience of the universe. We're limited with our human bodies. What John is describing, those two things, that display couldn't happen without the emptiness. It's only because everything is in flux, constantly changing, that it's not bound up like concrete, that things can manifest. And because they do, for as long as they do, we can appreciate that. And, we use words like luminosity and brilliance, and it is. Think about life.
Another word they use a lot is bliss.
Yes.
Yeah, that this luminosity is blissful. Dewa in Tibetan. It's one of the big qualities of reality at a stage of the path enlightenment. Because everything is so extraordinarily vivid.
We were talking last night about trying to get beyond hope and fear, which are just labels for our own ego. We can't appreciate that brilliance, that luminosity, that bliss with hope and fear.
And self-attack. Self-attack is a big stopper.
And
So-
all that's standing in our way is ego. And Buddhism really works. That's why liberation is certain, Vicky.
And the first step for all of us is to recognize when we were lost in dream and come back to this present moment, indefinable, vivid, complex, infinitely complex. Perhaps beautiful in its vividness.
If I can add something here, one of the first insights of insight meditation or vipassana meditation, awareness meditation, is just how much we are thinking. When someone, and you often hear it when someone sits down and says, "I can't meditate," because they feel they can't meditate because they're thinking so much. When actually, that's one of the first awarenesses of meditation. We sit down to meditate and we see just how distracted and and how much thinking that we're doing all the time. And if you weren't meditating, or if you weren't doing something to look at your mind the way we do, just to observe your mind, just to observe it. And if you ask somebody who had no curiosity, or even just inclination to look at their minds, and you ask them whether they were lost in thought, they would say, "No, I'm not lost in thought." They wouldn't even know what you were talking about. How you spend your day not in the present moment, and they wouldn't know. But when you sit down to look at your mind in meditation, just to observe it, that's where you see just how, where we see just how distracted and how much thinking that we're doing all the time, and not focused on the present moment, you know, and how much we cling and are attached and are addicted to our thoughts, because they're so compelling. And, another thing about, the truth of suffering is that it's caused by clinging and attachment, right? And if we recognize how much thinking we're doing and how much we are clinging to the thoughts as if they were real, the mind is not as agitated, because the mind that doesn't cling is not agitated. And we're all, I mean, think about your own experience, when we're agitated, I think, in my experience anyway, and you can see if this is true for yourself, is that I am clinging to thoughts. And if I wasn't clinging to the thoughts, I wouldn't be agitated. I wouldn't be, anxious about something in the future, or, or confused or about what I'm feeling, or, feeling frustration or anger or resentment at times, and that all comes from clinging. That all comes from attachment to my thoughts. In order to recognize the attachment, we have to recognize that we're thinking, like, all the time, and see the difference between just recognizing that we're thinking and being lost in thought. So we're not trying to stop our thoughts and stop our thinking, which is why people say, I can't meditate, because that's what they think it is. We're just trying to recognize thinking and acknowledge thinking as it happens. So that's another way of saying what Philip was saying before, if you just pay attention, liberation is inevitable.
That's a really good way to look at it, because without awareness, you do get the liberation. And then you can remember that from the Buddhist point of view, the mind is just one of the five of the six consciousnesses. And the other five are pointing outwards into this universe that you're living in. It's only the mind that's pointing inwards. And if that's the only place you ever are, you're missing the whole thing. You're missing the entire universe. Really, what could be more awful than that? No matter how interesting your thoughts are, they can't compare with the universe.
Henry, you're muted.
Um, is, is my internet connection okay right now?
I'm afraid you've got a bad connection.
No.
Sometimes people say if you turn your video
I'll
off,
try
the
again
audio might work
later.
better.
I'll try
Okay.
to fix my internet first.
Try turning your video off and see if that helps. Just speaking. You're muted as well as frozen right now.
Um, can can you hear me okay?
Is this Henry speaking?
Henry, the audio is much better now.
But it shows her being muted.
Can you
But now there is no audio, Henry. But you're shown as muted now.
Yeah, your bandwidth is too limited, I'm afraid. Yep, she's gonna try to reconnect.
I think limited bandwidth is a good metaphor for clinging to our thoughts.
That's true.
It's perfect.
That's true. All this obfuscation and junk in our minds eats up all of our bandwidth.
So it's a real lesson in clinging, attaching. Boy, I really want to hear her. What does she have to say? What am I missing? I'm missing out. It's called FOMO, right? Fear of missing out. Damn. Oh, she's back.
I was just going to add, and it's a really small detail, but Vicky was reminding me of it when she was talking about her situation and saying, my pain. And one of the practices that I wanted to offer, because I practice it myself, to not let, I mean, obviously there's always going to be some degree of ego unless you've lost your mind, but there can be more distance away from what we're identifying with. So I would start focusing on every time I said, you know, my pain, my depression, my anxiety, and even just removing my, so that it's simply pain. It's collective pain. Here's an experience where, you know, I'm now experiencing pain, they're experiencing pain. It's just pain, or it's just anxiety, it's just fear rather than mine. And focusing on reducing wherever possession is showing up. That is, you know, reinforcing the ego and having the ego feel special, even if it's in a negative sense, and to reduce whatever the state is. It's just pain. It's just, you know, depression, rather than amplifying it with the specialness of it being our own and being curious about it instead. I find that it actually reduces pain overall. I know my pain threshold is like very, very high at this point in my life because of having to practice that. But I hear it a lot, and I know I've done that myself for many years. My pain, you know, my suffering, and just reducing it to it's collective suffering. Here's my chance to understand what everyone else is experiencing too, so that we can suffer together and understand compassion from our own, you know, personal experience.
Thank you. That's good. Thank you very much, Amy. Amazing how profound these very first teachings by the Buddha are. The story goes, for those of you who don't know, that after he achieved enlightenment, he felt it was not something he could communicate. And so he wandered for 40 days, supposedly. And then he came across some people with whom he had practiced before his enlightenment, yogis. And they saw that something was changed in him. And they asked him for teaching. They asked him to explain what he'd gone through or discovered. And so at a place called the Jeta Grove, outside Varanasi, in an area called Sarnath, Jeta Grove was a grove of trees. They sat down and he gave the teachings of the Four Noble Truths and the 8 paths, the 8 aspects of the path, but especially the Four Noble Truths. If you go there today to Sarnath, where the Jeta Grove is, there's a huge stupa, which was erected as a monument to him. It must be a couple of 100 feet high, big dome. And you circumambulate it clockwise as an act of devotion. This chapter starts out with a phrase. I think John read it, but I find it very profound. He says, we always work with what is there or here, our own experience. And we find that our basic existence is fundamentally awake. Here it is. But at the same time, there are obstacles, ego, and habitual patterns, which manifest in all sorts of ways. I like this one too. He says, in order for us to understand who we are and what we are doing with ourselves, it is absolutely necessary for us to realize how we torture ourselves. The torturing process we impose on ourselves is a habitual pattern, continual and ongoing. What gluttons we are for punishment.
I think when we recognize our thinking, as opposed to, kind of reifying and solidifying our thoughts that we do when we're lost in them. When we solidify them and reify them and make and just we're lost in them, so we're feeling that they're real, then we're tormented by them. But when we recognize thoughts as thoughts, we're not tormented by them, right? We don't, you know, we don't torture ourselves with them because they're just thoughts. It's just thinking.
It's useful to put thoughts on the same level that we put sounds, sights, smells, touches, because they are essentially no different than those other five. They come from nowhere, seem to last for a while, and they seem to go away somewhere or nowhere. We give thoughts this special status. It's the ego doing that because it's my thought, right? It's got to be important. It's also my smell or my sight, my sound, and yet somehow those things seem less important. But they're, I think, equally. I think they deserve to be on the same level.
The last I think it's the last sentence in the chapter. I don't know, I wrote it down. He says, we can actually declare that as non-theistic Buddhists, we can free the whole world from pain. That's the greatest news. And we are going to do it properly, rather than by worshiping somebody or going into a trance.
Sign me up.
You're already signed, Fred.
Sorry, you're already here.
Yeah, really.
John, where did that statement come from?
The end of the chapter, 50,
Okay.
so somewhere near the end. I think it's right at the very end. I didn't write down page reference, but well, there are a number of people we haven't heard from. Anybody have comments about suffering? Sarah, Darlin, Tanya. No.
I'm just absorbing everything. That's what I find myself doing in the classes. No real input, just kind of whoa. The suffering isn't a fun thing to be thinking about and to be to this part. It's like, oh, so that's what's going on. A little bit of that.
You think it might influence your writing?
Yeah, I'm sure. Well, I'm not sure how yet. I think it already is with everything that I'm doing with the characters. So there's a lot of clarity in more clarity in what people are going through and what it means after doing this.
Darlin's a wonderful writer. I've read some of her stories, and they're very powerful. And surprising, Darlin. I mean, I never would have expected you, the way you present, to write those kinds of stories.
Lots of suffering in the stories.
A lot of suffering. They're very hard-edged. You know? Yeah. Tanya.
Well, I'm just thankful to have tools for the next uprise in my suffering. At school as a teacher, I'm very much challenged by different students and their behaviors. And I always am trying to keep the even line for my attitude and my perspective. And it is extremely challenging to keep yourself well balanced. So again, I'm thankful for the tools and to remember to be aware in those situations, step back, keep calm, and be centered.
You teach art, am I correct?
Yep. In
in
Hartford.
Mm-hmm. At the high school level?
Middle school.
Middle school.
Yep. So basically 8th graders all day long.
Oh, what a wonderful age.
Yep. And my school is called Sports Medical Science. So it's a lot of males, boys that go there for sports and not necessarily arts. But yeah.
But it's so great that they teach art still. So many schools cut art from the curriculum.
Yeah, I do my best to let them have a glimpse or a doorway into that side of the world.
Have you ever studied the Eastern art, like Japanese or Chinese?
Yeah, Hokusai is my favorite artist.
Oh, really? That's fabulous.
Yes.
Yeah, what an amazing person you are. Ah, that's terrific. And do you bring that into your teaching?
Yep, I do.
Oh,
Yep.
that's even better. Wow.
I even have a club starting next week, and I do mindfulness clubs and practices. I've taught yoga and clubs and things like that too.
Terrific.
So like I said, art is very much similar to mindfulness practices.
Bodhisattva work. You do. Hmm.
Yeah, I
Very
find
much.
that.
Yep. I'm sorry. I was just going to say to Tonya, I have a son who's in the seventh grade, and is in his elementary school. They had taught mindfulness training to the kids enough so that they stopped sending them to the principal, and they began simply to send them out in the hall to do mindfulness exercises.
Yeah, that's great. That's wonderful. Yeah, in my art club, they're gonna do tiger tie-dyes. Our mascot is the tiger. And the kids that earn those are gonna be the school's peacemakers, kids that lead peaceful, nonviolent ways or help solve issues like that. So we're gonna make all the tiger tie-dyed shirts for those kids to earn.
Wonderful. Brett, I'm sorry I cut you off.
That's okay. I should have raised my hand.
I'm just
Yeah.
going to share the screen here for a second. Here's Hokusai. Some very famous. I mean, does it get any more famous than those waves?
Right.
Yeah. And then
Yeah, I recognize that. Yeah.
it's just terrific stuff. Look at that, the Great Wave of Kanagawa.
And Mount Fuji series.
Yeah, didn't do 100 views of Fuji,
Yeah.
something like that.
Yeah.
Went to an exhibit at the Brooklyn Museum, views of Edo. That was Hokusai, and I have a couple of his prints framed around. Yeah.
8th grade. What is it? They're about 12 years old.
Yeah.
Hmm. You cut in. Some people haven't spoken. Sarah, do you have anything?
Well, I guess, first of all, thank you all. This was an amazing discussion. I wanted to be here so badly, and there were so many obstacles. Right at the end of work, all these things came up, so I found myself kind of getting frantic to get here in time to meditate. And then, in between meditation and the class, my kids wanted me to go drive them somewhere, and I was really trying to put the Dharma as my first priority. I ended up caving and then frantically went and did it for them. And then freneticism, the kids were picking up on it. My daughter left her phone in the place where I picked her up from. And then she was screaming at me during the class to get her phone for her. And I was sitting here just trying to figure out what to do. went to sit here in the class. I could barely hear what was going on. She was just so upset about not having her phone. But at the same time, I thought that was probably maybe she had her phone. So I tried sitting with her and calming down, but she ended up dragging me out, and I went and got her phone for her. And it's just funny that this whole thing was about suffering, and I don't know. I'm just so confused because I feel like a lot of suffering happened. Our thoughts, like her thought about the phone, my thought about wanting to be in this class, but I don't know. How do you like making the Dharma your priority? How do you balance that? You know, it's tricky. Right?
So as a mother, that's your priority, right? There's no way around that. So how do you fit Dharma in on top of that? Sometimes it's going to be impossible. I can send you the transcript of the class. That'd work. How old is your daughter?
I can watch it after. She's 11.
She's 12,
11.
11. Yeah, it's a hard age.
Yeah, but Dharma's helped me so much to be able to stay patient and be a better mom. So,
I think that recognition is putting the Dharma in your life.
yeah.
You know, what I mean, you're talking about it in a way that you wouldn't if you weren't putting the Dharma in your life.
It's funny during this whole about what just happened. Thank you. And Henry, I'm really glad you went to the effort to share.
Thank you.
That's all I have tonight.
There's a lot of background noise coming from you, John. Here. Yeah, just got quiet.
I think it's the furnace. It's the heat.
Ah, well, turn it off. Who needs it?
There would be.
Shall we do the closing chants?
Sure, sure.
Okay, I'll put them up. And who's leading? I've forgotten. Philip. Right?
Sure. We will end with a prayer for peace, and by dedicating the merit generated through our practice to the benefit of all sentient beings. By the blessings of enlightened and compassionate ones, by the power of my positive actions of 3 times and my prayers of pure aspiration, may wars, conflicts, epidemics, and all other maladies dissolve in this world, and may the earth and all who live on this earth enjoy the abundance of well-being. May all learn to live lovingly with each other. By this merit, may all obtain omniscience. May it defeat the enemy, wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may I free all beings. By the confidence of the golden sun of the great East, may the lotus garden of the Rigdon's wisdom bloom. May the dark ignorance of sentient beings be dispelled. May all beings enjoy profound, brilliant glory.
Good night, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Great
you.
way to spend an evening.
Thank you all. Thank you, Phil.
Thanks for your
Thank
practice,
you,
everyone.
everyone. Nice conversation.
Thanks, John.
Thanks, John Tyler. Thank you, Philip.
Thank you, everybody.
Good night, everyone.